Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 132. No one is trademark adult enough to handle this shit. Toshinori felt like he was going to fall apart at the seams. He had only caught glimpses of Midoriya yesterday, and he looked awful. The bags under his eyes were worse than they had been at the height of their training, but he hadn't reached out to him. Midoriya clearly didn't want to talk about whatever had happened, but the worry was eating him alive. He was going to be with Class 1A for heroics today, and he tried to tell himself that seeing him in one piece would be enough to soothe his nerves. But he wasn't very convincing. Midoriya didn't seem any more rested today than he had the day before, and he was just as skittish and shy as he had been the day they met. He hadn't realized how much progress the boy had made until it was gone. His performance in class was admirable, but he knew the boy was capable of more, though perhaps not right now he wasn't. He kept an eye out for him. He didn't linger close to Toshinori's side like he usually did, and that realization stung more than he cared to admit. What had happened? And why didn't he feel like he could come to him for help? He would figure out how to give that boy the world if he only just asked for it. The moment class was dismissed, Midoriya fled to the locker rooms without sparing him a glance. He didn't want to be overbearing, but he needed to speak with him. He had hardly been able to sleep not knowing what was going on. He didn't need the full story, but he needed to hear from Midoriya himself that he was safe now. He wasted no time in changing back into his normal suit in hopes that he could catch Midoriya before he left. Midoriya, my boy! He should have known better than to choose the disused hallway All Might had shown him as a hiding place. He wasn't exactly hiding from All Might, but he wasn't not hiding from him either. The last few days had been exhausting, and his guilt had been eating at him like a ravenous dog. He had planned to tell All Might the truth anyway. Just because that plan didn't really pan out didn't mean he was off the hook. All Might deserved to know the truth. Hi, All Might, he greeted in return. I. All Might started but quickly trailed off. He was tense as his eyes searched Izuku's body for injury. Are you all right? He instinctively went to say yes, he was fine, but that wasn't true by any metric, and All Might didn't deserve to be fed another lie. I've been better, he settled on. I don't. There was supposed to be a meeting. It was canceled, and everyone's been rather tight-lipped about the whole thing. I. You don't need to tell me what happened, but you're safe now, right? All Might asked. He looked so sad and worried, and God, the guilt was so overwhelming. He could hardly breathe through it. Yeah, I'm. Yes, I'm safe now. I'm sorry, he choked out. No, my boy, you have nothing to apologize for. No, I do. I lied to you. He forced himself to look him in the eye as he said that constantly for months. Ever since the day we met, I've been lying through my teeth. Before All Might got the chance to respond to that, someone walked past the opening of the hallway. They didn't look down to check out what was happening, and even if they did, they would have only been able to see All Might as Izuku was hidden behind a crook in the wall. But still, All Might offered an out. Do you want to speak privately? Or another time? He asked. You don't need to tell me anything, as long as you're safe. I couldn't care less about whatever you lied about, he added, though Izuku could tell it wasn't true. He cared a lot about what Izuku had been lying about, and he had the right to know. Yeah, that's probably for the best. Somewhere else, I mean, he replied. All Might studied him warily for a moment before nodding. Come with me, he said before turning on his heel and leading the way to somewhere. Izuku followed dutifully. The room he was led to looked to be a meeting room of some sort. It looked private enough. It seemed unlikely that anyone would disturb them, but even so, Izuku locked the door behind himself. If he was going to bring up One for All in any capacity, he didn't want someone to wander in and overhear it. He sat down on the couch across from the armchair All Might had settled in and held his backpack to his chest like a scared child with a teddy bear. He knew he probably looked pathetic, but, well, he felt pathetic, so he may as well look the part. All Might looked like he had 1,000 questions, but he was too polite to ask any of them, and Izuku just wanted to get this over with. My mom left years ago. He forced himself to speak before he could chicken out of the conversation. All Might didn't say anything. He just stared back at Izuku blankly. He was really hoping that he would ask follow-up questions or lead the discussion somehow, but Izuku knew he wasn't owed that, so he forced himself to continue. I've been on my own for almost 4 years. His hands were trembling where he had them gripped onto his backpack. What do you mean, on your own? All Might ask after a tense moment of silence. I've, it's just been me. I don't, he sputtered out before trailing off. He couldn't force himself to spell everything out. He had been homeless. He didn't think that in and of itself was something he was ashamed of. But, well, you learn something new every day. Where you live in an apartment. Your mother must have at least paid rent. When did you last speak to her? He asked. I I don't live in an apartment. He tried to explain, but the words wouldn't make it out of his mouth. What do you if you didn't then where surely you don't mean All Might trailed off. The look on his face was begging Izuku to take back his words, but he couldn't. He ran out of lies, and all that was left was the ugly truth. I didn't want to be put in the system. No one wants the quirkless kid. It was better that way. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I'm sorry. No, stop. All Might cut off his blubbering. He was crying. When did he start crying? Why was he always crying? He forced himself to look back up at All Might, but he immediately regretted it. He looked angry, and the urge to apologize again was difficult to stomp down. All Might had told him to stop, and he wasn't stupid enough to disobey a direct order when he was already mad. All Might's hands were shaking as he dragged them through his hair, and Izuku could feel his pulse in the pit of his stomach. When All Might looked back up at him, his expression softened, and he looked contemplative for a brief second before he spoke. You have nothing to apologize for. Izuku had no clue how long he sat there staring dumbly back at All Might before he spoke again. Why didn't you tell me? All Might all but pleaded. He looked devastated. He looked betrayed, and it was almost too much for Izuku to stomach. No honest answer he gave would do anything but upset All Might further, so Izuku didn't say anything. He watched him as he propped his chin up on his fists and leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees. He looked out into nothing for what felt like an eternity before his focus returned to Izuku. None of what happened to you was your fault. The way you were treated was not your fault. I. Someone should have. He cut himself off and scrubbed at his face. Eraser had essentially told him the same thing. They were far too forgiving. They blamed the fact that he was a kid. Like that made up for all the lies he told. But it wasn't even true. He wasn't a kid, and he hadn't been since he was 4 years old. Of all people, he would have expected All Might to understand that. Everything he did and every lie he told was a deliberate decision that he made, and those decisions hurt people. He wasn't a child. What he did was wrong, and he knew it. Why was everyone so eager to let him off the hook? No, no, it wasn't fair to you. You trusted me, and I used that against you. You should never have been put in the situation to make that decision in the first place. It, but I was, and I did. Izuku cut him off. Whether or not someone else is to blame, I broke your trust, and I did it intentionally. He insisted with more resolve than he knew he had in him. No, my boy, no. You lied to protect yourself. Any perceived breach of my trust was collateral damage. All Might argued back. He sounded so tired. Why the hell wasn't anyone mad at him? And why was he mad that no one was mad at him? He wanted to scream at everyone and ask them all why they were being so stupid, but he bit his tongue. I'm sorry that I failed to notice you were struggling so much. I had all the pieces. I should have put the puzzle together, All Might added after a long moment of silence. The apology only made him angrier. He wasn't a damn child. He didn't put the pieces together because Izuku didn't let him. He had been fighting to get everyone off his ass for years. No one noticed because he didn't let them. It was deliberate. It was willful. It was premeditated. And everyone was just cooing at him like he was a kitten left in a box on the side of the road. He wasn't some helpless victim. Why the hell wasn't anyone mad at him? The people you're staying with, do they treat you well? All Might asked, either ignoring or not noticing Izuku's mounting fury. Yes, Izuku answered shortly. Good, that's good. All Might replied, only sounding half present in the conversation. You'll tell me if they don't? Please, please tell me if they don't. He looked uncertain and guilty for even asking, and Izuku felt worse lying to him again. Yeah, I will. Eraser had every right to treat him poorly. He didn't expect him to, but he wouldn't jeopardize the man's career if he did. They're expecting me home soon, Izuku said, glancing at the clock to sell his point. Another lie. He did it without even meaning to. He wasn't expected anywhere for another half hour, but he kept that to himself. He was selfish, and he was a coward. Oh, I'm sorry for keeping you, my boy. You can, he trailed off, gesturing toward the door. I just need a minute, All Might added as he looked at the floor. It felt wrong to leave him here like this, but it also felt like he was sitting in a pot of slowly boiling water. His burning shame only got worse and worse the longer he stayed. A primal survival instinct deep in his gut was telling him to run, and he was too spineless to stand up to it, so he obeyed it like a dog with its tail between its legs. Toshinori sat in the meeting room and stared off into nothing until the golden light from the window started to shine directly into his eyes. The sun was setting. He had been here for hours, but he still didn't make any effort to move. He didn't know how much longer he sat there until the door swung open to reveal Netsu. You've been here for quite some time, Yagi, the stoat greeted softly. He was homeless, wasn't he? He asked, ignoring Nedzu's observation. I cannot answer that, he responded in a tone tinged with too much regret to mean that the answer to Toshinori's question was no. Who's leading the investigation? He asked, hoping for any sort of answer. That had nothing to do with Midoriya's personal information. He could answer that question. Nedzu shut the door behind himself and walked over to sit down on the couch across from him where Midoriya had been earlier. Your secrets are safe. You don't need to. That's not what I'm concerned about. Toshinori cut him off. In an official capacity, Detective Tsukauchi has taken over the case. However, given that his plate is rather full at the moment, Eraserhead will be doing the majority of the footwork, so to speak. Aizawa? He asked without even meaning to reply. Yes, he was the one who found Midoriya last Wednesday night, or rather Thursday morning. Nedzu replied politely. Oh. That didn't sit right with him. He took a moment to parse out why, and when he arrived at a conclusion, he wished he hadn't poked the bear. Aizawa had gotten to the root of this issue in hardly more than a month of knowing Midoriya. It had nearly been a year since they had met, and he had failed to notice. Perverse jealousy and self-loathing settled heavily in his chest. Isn't that a conflict of interest? He asked more bitterly than he had intended to. Do you want more people involved in this case? Nedzu challenged. No, he didn't. But he did want to know why the hell he wasn't involved in this case. Both the detective and Nedzu knew what Midoriya was to him. He should have been questioned at the very least, seeing as though he'd known the boy nearly a full year now and failed to report the obvious signs he'd displayed. The case is in good hands, Yagi. Aizawa is a thorough man. No one will escape justice, and Midoriya is safe. Though I would be prepared to let him in on your little secret, I fear he's too diligent to not figure it out sooner or later. Nedzu added after he didn't respond. That's why Nelmasa had brought that up the last time they spoke. He tried not to feel angry at his friend for not having told him what was going on, but it burned in his gut regardless. You are not the only one who failed to notice the signs. Midoriya is clever. He hid everything from many people for quite a long time. I'm not sure how long he would have been able to pull the wool over my eyes if it hadn't been for certain exacerbating circumstances, and you know how rare it is for something to sneak under my radar. Sitting here and beating yourself up is not helping anyone. Go home. Get some rest. Midoriya needs steady people to rely on, and you will not be that if you sit here all night, he admonished. Nedzu had such a logical way of navigating emotions. He'd known him for many years. He knew the creature didn't feel things the same way humans would, but he had a very thorough understanding of the human psyche. It was odd. Usually, intellectual types didn't waste their efforts on emotions. But Nedzu studied them like anything else, meticulously, leaving no stone unturned. He had a clinical type of wisdom that Toshinori was rarely, if ever, able to find fault in. Still, he stayed in place until the stoat slid off the couch and left the room, pointedly leaving the door open on his way out. Eventually, he got up on unsteady legs and made his way home in a daze. Home. Homeless. His boy had been homeless for years. How had no one noticed? How had he not noticed? The boy had admitted he was short on food, for God's sake, and that didn't even tip him off. What kind of hero was he? A child was struggling right under his nose for months, and he had done nothing. Blessedly, he was able to get himself home before tears started to slide down his cheeks. He sat on the couch and stared at the far wall as they fell silently. He didn't know how to make it up to him. He didn't know that there was anything he could do to make it up to him. He had failed miserably, and there was nothing he could do to fix that. How could he have done that to him? How could his mother have done that to him? How could anyone look at that boy and not see what Toshinori saw? There was too much guilt and self-loathing mixed in with his anger for him to feel it properly. He wished he could just be angry. That would be easier to cope with. He knew anger well. He knew how to stuff it inside a jar and bury it behind all the other things he needed to concern himself with. Guilt, however, guilt clung to him too closely. Every time he tried to push it away, it would stick to him. The more he fought it, the worse it became, like a mouse in a glue trap. He had been stuck in that trap to varying degrees for decades, but now he was well and truly pinned. His heart was pumping wildly, sending adrenaline through his veins, begging him to get away from the wretched feeling, but he knew better than to waste the energy trying to fight it. He was stuck where he sat on the couch, and there was no escape from it. There was no escape from what he had done, or rather, what he had failed to do. He felt as lost as he did the day Nana had died. He felt like a child. He felt clueless. Toshinori woke up on the couch with his bones screaming bloody murder at him. Everything hurt, but he supposed that was well deserved. He sat up, slowly stretching out his limbs. He hadn't taken his evening medication, and he had slept on the couch. It was the perfect recipe for an awful morning, if not an awful entire day. His pain had woken him up. The sun seemed to have just begun rising from what he could tell by the lighting in the room. Hopefully, it wasn't just a gloomy day. Rain certainly wouldn't help the aching in his bones. He stood up, supporting his weight on the armrest of the couch, and stayed still until he was sure that his legs wouldn't give out from under him when he took a step forward. He immediately made his way to the bathroom and started running a bath. He had work today, and he couldn't be seen walking around like his muscles were going to snap if he moved too quickly. Usually his left hip was the only persistent ache he dealt with. He supposed that meant the meds were doing their job. The hot water helped immediately. He should have taken his meds so that they had time to kick in by the time he got out, but he was too relieved to leave now. He stayed there until the water grew cool, and he heard his alarm going off in the other room. He toweled dry, threw a robe on, shut the alarm off, and made his accursed breakfast smoothie to chase the handful of pills he had to take in order to stay functional. Some days he took them without any sort of introspection, but some days the thought of them left a bitter taste on his tongue. Today was one of those days. Perhaps his brain was trying to latch on to anything other than yesterday's revelations. It wasn't working. He was just miserable twice over. The ache in his bones settled for the most part, but the pitiful remnants of his stomach were not pleased with him skipping meds and a meal. He felt nauseous. He had to force down his breakfast slowly and tortuously. It felt like drinking tar. and he couldn't imagine that it tasted much better either. He brushed his teeth and dressed himself, but didn't bother trying to fix his hair. He couldn't bear the thought of looking in the mirror. It looked like a rat's nest no matter what he did, so there really wasn't any point. Staring at his front door with his shoes on didn't seem to clue him into the fact that it was time to leave now. The task of turning the knob and opening the door seemed to be too much for his limbs to handle. He had been arriving to UA obscenely early ever since the USJ, but today he stood there in his Genkon until he would be late if he stayed a second longer. The sterile white paint on the door failed to give him answers to the questions he didn't have the strength to ask. End of chapter.